In 1850, Los Angeles was a small cattle ranching town of about 1,600 people, smaller than a large modern high school. By 1900, it had jumped to about 102,000 people, more than a 6,000% increase since 1850, fueled by railroad connections, land speculation, and aggressive booster campaigns. By 1930, it had reached about 1.2 million people, making it the fifth largest city in the United States and one of the fastest-growing big cities in modern history. But the real story is not just the numbers, it is the violence, ambition, water wars, and forced removals behind the machine that turned a semi-arid basin into a global dream factory. This is Los Angeles. Before there were freeways, before there were film studios, before there were 10 million people baking in the Southern California sun, this was a river valley, a basin ringed by mountains with oak groves, wetlands, and winter floods along the Los Angeles River. The Tongva people, whom the Spanish later labeled Gabrielino after Mission San Gabriel, had lived in this basin for at least 7,000 years. They called the river Paime Paxaait, and they knew every shift of its current. Then in September 1781, 44 pobladores of indigenous African and mixed Spanish descent came north from what is now Mexico, sent by the Spanish Empire to settle this frontier. They founded what they called El Pueblo de la Reina de los Angeles, the town of the Queen of the Angels, a small farming settlement on the empire's far edge. For roughly 65 years after 1781, Los Angeles dozed under Spanish and then Mexican rule. It was rancho country, sprawling cattle estates where life followed the seasons more than the clock. Then the United States went to war with Mexico. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo formally transferred California and with it Los Angeles to the United States. Gold fever exploded in Northern California in 1849. Los Angeles was left out of the rush, but it fed the miners. Cattle ranchers grew rich selling beef to the goldfields, and for one brief decade, the California way of life seemed indestructible. In 1850, when California became a state, Los Angeles had a population of exactly 1,610 people. It was a rough, violent, sun-baked frontier town with more saloons than schools. Then disaster struck. A catastrophic sequence of flood and drought in the 1860s killed vast herds of cattle and wrecked the ranching economy. The great ranchos collapsed, and many California families who had held hundreds of square miles saw their lands slip away. American lawyers and land speculators swept in under a U.S. legal system that claimed to honor Spanish-Mexican land grants but buried them in costly litigation. They stripped many California families of their ancestral estates through debt, legal manipulation, and outright theft. By 1870, Los Angeles had 5,728 people. It was changing. Anglo-American settlers were arriving. New wooden buildings were replacing adobe. But the city still had no railroad, no real harbor, no reason for the world to care. The Los Angeles River, the same waterway the Tongva had depended on for millennia, still ran free. In wet winters, it flooded catastrophically. In dry summers, it shrank to a trickle. The river would define the city's fate, but change was coming on iron rails. In September 1876, the Southern Pacific Railroad finally connected Los Angeles to San Francisco and the National Rail Network. The isolation was over. The avalanche was about to begin. Land prices soared, doubling and more in boom districts. Real estate offices lined the streets. Speculators platted towns in the middle of the desert and sold them to Midwesterners who had never seen California. In 1887, a fare war between Southern Pacific and the new Santa Fe drove the fare from Kansas City to California down to just $1. In 1887 alone, scores of new towns were platted in Los Angeles County. Some accounts say around 60. Most would never be built. The bubble burst in 1888, but enough people stayed to transform the city forever. Walking through Los Angeles in 1888, you would have felt two worlds colliding, the crumbling adobe past and the frantic, wooden future. Everything smelled of sawdust and ambition. The population that had been 11,000 in 1880 rocketed to 50,000 by 1890. The city was doubling and redoubling in a decade, a pace that modern urban planners would call unsustainable. And who were these people? They came from everywhere. Midwestern farmers fleeing cold winters, Southern African Americans seeking opportunity beyond Jim Crow's reach, Japanese and Chinese workers who had built the railroads, Mexican families whose grandparents had owned this land. Los Angeles already had a Chinatown, though it was a place of enforced segregation as much as community. Chinese immigrants who had blasted through the Sierra Nevada to build the Transcontinental Railroad were now confined to a few city blocks by law and violence. By 1893, Los Angeles had a skyline. Small, modest, but a skyline nonetheless. And underneath every brick and beam, an infrastructure crisis was quietly ticking toward explosion. Here is a fact that should stop you cold. Los Angeles has almost no water of its own. William Mulholland was a self-taught Irish immigrant who rose to become the chief engineer of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. He understood something the city's boosters refused to admit. The Los Angeles River could not support a metropolis. In 1904, Mulholland and former mayor Fred Eaton made a secret journey to the Owens Valley, 233 miles to the north. They saw the solution, the Owens River fed by Sierra Nevada snowmelt flowing freely through a remote valley. What followed was one of the great conspiracies in American urban history. City officials quietly bought up Owens Valley land before the plan was announced. When it was revealed, the valley's farmers were devastated. Their future had been stolen. The Los Angeles Aqueduct was one of the largest engineering projects in American history up to that time. 233 miles of tunnels, siphons and open canals built by some 5,000 workers with mostly hand labor through brutal terrain. Working in 110-degree desert heat in summer and freezing mountain passes in winter, laborers, many of them Mexican, indigenous, and recent immigrants, carved a river out of rock for $3 a day. On November 5, 1913, William Mulholland stood before a crowd of thousands as water from the Owens Valley thundered down the spillway for the first time. He turned to the crowd and said only 5 words. There it is, take it. 5 words. And with them, Los Angeles had stolen a future. The Owens Valley was condemned to slow death. By the 1920s, the lake had begun to dry. Farms failed, communities dissolved. The people of the valley fought back, bombing sections of the aqueduct multiple times, but they were overpowered by the machine of Los Angeles. As Los Angeles committed to securing water from the Owens Valley, the city exploded. By 1910, the population had already hit 319,000. Downtown's Spring Street was earning the nickname the Wall Street of the West. New banks and office towers competed for the skyline. Henry Huntington's Pacific Electric Railway, the famous red cars, would eventually weave a web of more than 1,000 miles of track across Greater Los Angeles. By 1910, you could board downtown and ride to the beach, to the orange groves, to towns that barely existed yet. But who was this city really built for? Walking through the working-class neighborhoods of East Los Angeles in 1910, you would have smelled tortillas and heard Spanish, a reminder that this land had been Mexican long before it was American. Racial covenants written into property deeds legally barred African Americans, Asian Americans, and Mexican Americans from buying homes in most of the city. The dream of Los Angeles was explicitly, legally, a white dream. African Americans concentrated along Central Avenue, creating one of the most vibrant black cultural communities in America, west of Chicago. Jazz clubs, churches, newspapers, and businesses built a parallel city within the city. Little Tokyo had taken root south of City Hall. Japanese immigrants ran produce markets that fed the entire city, nurseries that supplied its gardens, and farms in the surrounding San Gabriel Valley that grew much of its food, all while facing laws designed to strip them of the very land they cultivated. Los Angeles had conquered the water problem. Now it needed a port. San Pedro, 20 miles south, was a shallow bay, but in a breathtaking feat of political manipulation, the city annexed a thin strip of land all the way to the coast, the shoestring strip they called it, and then they dredged one of the greatest artificial harbors on Earth. By 1920, the port of Los Angeles was one of the busiest ports on the Pacific coast of the Americas. Lumber from the Pacific Northwest, oil from California's new fields, goods flowing to and from Asia. The city had manufactured its own geography, then oil. In 1892, Edward Doheny struck oil just 2 miles from City Hall. By the 1920s, Los Angeles was the world's largest oil producer. Derricks rose in backyards, on school grounds, on Wilshire Boulevard. The city reeked of petroleum and wealth. The Signal Hill discovery of 1921 became one of the most spectacular oil strikes in American history. Within a year, the hill bristled with hundreds of derricks, nearly 1,000 by some counts. Developers understood what they were selling was not just real estate. It was sunshine, it was health, it was escape. Brochures mailed to cold, grey, Midwestern cities promised that Los Angeles cured tuberculosis, healed broken spirits, and delivered perpetual spring. Tens of thousands came seeking a cure for tuberculosis, the great killer of the era. The dry, warm air was considered therapeutic. Many of them died anyway. But enough recovered, or simply preferred death in sunshine to death in snow, that they stayed. By the mid-1920s, Wilshire Boulevard was being carved through the city from downtown to the sea. Bullock's Wilshire department store opened in 1929, a temple of Art Deco commerce that catered to people who arrived not by foot, but by automobile. By the mid-1920s, Los Angeles had more cars per person than almost anywhere else on Earth, roughly 1 car for every 3 residents. Twice the national average. The result was sprawl, beautiful, terrifying, unprecedented sprawl. Low-density bungalows spread across the basin in every direction. By 1920, Los Angeles sprawled over far more land than older eastern cities, with similar or larger populations, a low-density pattern that stunned visiting planners. And then there was Hollywood. In 1910, it was a quiet agricultural community of 5,000 people that had voted to merge with Los Angeles largely to get access to the city's water supply. Nobody imagined it would become the entertainment capital of the world. The first film companies had migrated west from New York and New Jersey to escape the monopoly of Thomas Edison's motion picture patents company. California offered year-round sunshine, varied landscapes, and crucially, enough distance from Edison's lawyers. By the early 1920s, Hollywood was producing 80% of the world's motion pictures. The studio system, Paramount, MGM, Universal, Warner Brothers, was being assembled. Los Angeles was manufacturing not just products, but global desire. On Bunker Hill, Victorian mansions looked down on tenement housing below. A block from a millionaire's Tudor revival estate, immigrant laborers in unpainted bungalows rose before dawn to build the next block of mansions. The city's boosters sold paradise. The city's workers lived something else. Mexican laborers in the agricultural valleys earned pennies per hour. Asian immigrants farmed land they were legally forbidden to own. Black families were confined by covenant to a thin sliver of the city. Los Angeles was aggressively anti-union. The Los Angeles Times, owned by the fiercely anti-labor Harrison Gray Otis, led a decades-long war on organized labor. In 1910, a bomb destroyed the Times building, killing 21 people. The city used the attack to crush the labor movement for another generation. In the early 1920s, Los Angeles set its sights on the world's biggest stage. In 1923, the International Olympic Committee awarded the city the 1932 Games, a declaration that this dusty western outpost had become a global contender. When the Depression hit in 1929, many thought the Games would collapse, but Los Angeles insisted on hosting anyway. Over the summer of 1932, roughly 1.2 million spectators filled the stands, about as many people as actually lived in the city at the time. The city put on its best face, palm trees, new boulevards, and a freshly burnished Colosseum, and sent a message: Los Angeles had arrived. This view shows Union Station in 1939, brand new and gleaming, its Mission Moderne tower rising over a broad forecourt of palm trees and taxis, while inside sunlight slices through high windows onto tiled floors where travelers in fedoras and summer dresses wait beneath ponderous ceiling beams for trains that promise escape in every direction. This view shows Compton Street in the early 1930s, a low, sun-washed corridor of modest storefronts and bungalows, Model A Fords angled at the curb, and hand-painted signs promising cheap groceries, auto repair, and cold soda to neighborhood families riding out the hard years of the Depression. This view shows Figueroa Street in the early 1940s, lined with streetcars, billboards, and low-rise storefronts, its lanes already filling with wartime traffic and neon signs flickering on at dusk. This view shows Crenshaw Boulevard just after World War II, new tract homes and small businesses spreading along the road as returning veterans and Japanese-American families rebuild their lives in a changing neighborhood. This view shows Avalon Boulevard in South Los Angeles, modest shops, gas stations, and crowded sidewalks where factory workers and families move between streetcars and 1940s cars under a hazy California sky. The city is changing, slowly, incompletely, imperfectly. The metro system, buses and trains together, now carries around 1 million weekday riders threading rail lines and busways through neighborhoods that freeways once sliced apart. Protected bike lanes have appeared where there were once only speeding cars. Mixed-use developments rise near transit stops in districts where single-family zoning had frozen time and land values for nearly a century. The history of Los Angeles is not over, it is being written right now, and the version we will inherit depends entirely on the choices being made in the present. If there is another city, another era, or another moment in history you'd like to see brought back to life, let me know in the comment.